Okay, last week Bobby was talking about authority in the Bible, and he touched on instrumental music, and he's right. Everything about that in the authority of the Bible is correct. And if that were all we had, that's all we would need. That should be. If Jehovah God spoke it and told us that that's what we needed, then that should be enough. It is enough. It's enough. But there is a reason why the first century Christians rejected instrumental music. God just didn't arbitrarily raise up and say, we're just going to do away with this instrumental music thing, and we're not going to do it anymore. There is a reason for it, and a good one. And this is the subject of a pretty enormous study, and it takes probably 2 or 3 hours to go through, so we're going to look at the quickie version, but we've got a lot of young people in our congregation, and there is a growing sentiment within the Lord's church that instrumental music might be an optional thing. And the very fact that God said sing, that He ordered it, should be enough. But when you look around, we see practically all of the denominational bodies that use it. And I have come across some of the Lord's church who do in my travels. So there is a reason why that the New Testament Christians rejected it. And we know this from a historical fact that they did. They did not use it. Instrumental music did not enter into the church until about 700 years after Christ. So, what was it? What was it that kept them? Because they had them in the Old Testament. King David used them all the time. And they used them in Old Testament worship. And we're going to look at that. Because that's the key to figuring out why. But why? Something was pretty important that kept the use of man-made mechanical instruments out of the church for 700 years. It was a Catholic Pope, by the way, that introduced them for the first time. If my memory serves, it's Pope Boniface, but don't hold me to that. About 700-ish, give or take, after AD, after Christ, after the death of Christ. So we don't use them. But there's a lot of them out there that do. And so whenever this subject comes up and somebody asks you, it would be a good thing if we knew the reason, I think. So since Bobby brought it up, and I don't want to step on his little parade, I'm just going to kind of fit this into the middle here somewhere. And to introduce this lesson, let's turn to 2 Chronicles 29. 2 Chronicles 29. And I think this is the King James Version. I don't see. I've got it printed out, but I think it's the King James. Anyway. There are easier to understand translations out there, and most of you have them. Oh, my computer software defaults to the King James. 2 Chronicles 29, 20 through 31. Let's start reading in verse 20. Then Hezekiah, the king, rose early and gathered the rulers of the city and went up to the house of the Lord. And they brought 7 bullocks and 7 rams and 7 lambs and 7 he-goats for a sin offering for the kingdom. Sin offering. and for the sanctuary, and for Judah. And he commanded the priests and the sons of Aaron to offer them on the altar of the Lord. This is the burnt offering that they're getting ready to do here. So they killed the bullocks, and the priests received the blood and sprinkled it on the altar. Likewise, when they had killed the rams, they sprinkled the blood upon the altar, and they killed also the lambs, and they sprinkled the blood upon the altar. And they brought forth the he-goats for the sin offering before the king and the congregation, and they laid their hands upon them. Notice it said in verse 23, sin offering. That's key. That's very important. And the priests killed them. And they made reconciliation. They made reconciliation with their blood upon the altar to make an atonement for all Israel. For the king commanded that the burnt offering and the sin offering should be made for all Israel. This was their yearly burnt offering sacrifice for the entire nation. Okay, verse 25. And he set the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals and psalteries and with harps, according to the commandment of David and of Gad the king's seer, and Nathan the prophet. For so was the commandment of the Lord by his prophets. Let's stop right there. Hezekiah did not decide to do this. Hezekiah was in the process of restoring the sacrificial system, the Levitical worship, if you will, the worship of the law of Moses. He was in the process of restoring that. So he went back and got the commandments from the king, the pattern to follow. Notice he said that. And that's important to this. And he set the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals and psalteries and with harps, according to the commandment of David and of Gad the king's seer, and Nathan the prophet. For so was the commandment of the Lord by his prophets. God commanded these instruments to be played by Levites in this worship service. It's a commandment. That is important. Let's file that away. We're going to look at that again. So the Levites stood, verse 26, with the instruments of David and the priests with the trumpets. And Hezekiah commanded to offer the burnt offering upon the altar. And when the burnt offering began, you catch that? When the burnt offering began, the song of the Lord began also with the trumpets and with the instruments ordained by David, king of Israel. And all the congregation worshipped, and the singers sang, and the trumpeters sounded, and all this continued. Now catch this. All of this continued until the burnt offering was finished. Very important. And when they had made an end of offering, the king and all that were present with him bowed themselves and worshipped. Verse 30. Moreover, Hezekiah the king and the princes commanded the Levites to sing praise unto the Lord with the words of David and of Asaph the seer. And they sang praises with gladness, and they bowed their heads and worshipped. Now we've got a dividing line here in the verse 31. We've got a dividing line. Something has changed. Hezekiah, it goes on to say, then Hezekiah answered and said, now you have been consecrated yourselves unto the Lord. Come near and bring sacrifices and thank offerings into the house of the Lord. And the congregation brought in sacrifices and thank offerings, and as many as were of a free heart burnt offerings. Okay. You have two parts to worship in the Old Testament. You have two parts. You have the first part, which is the atoning sacrifice, the burnt offerings. That atoning sacrifice is the part where the worshipers are brought, their sins are atoned for. Atonement carries the meaning of appeasement. It's not a permanent thing, because they have to do it every year. And to do this for the nation of Israel, they had to do it every year. The musical instruments that they used started and stopped with the atoning sacrifice. They were only part of the first part of Old Testament worship. When the part one, the first part of the atoning sacrifice, the burnt offering, is done, then the Israelites were consecrated. They were restored to fellowship with God. They were forgiven temporarily, albeit temporarily. It wasn't a permanent thing. God's wrath, His expectations, His demand for righteous judgment was appeased for a space. Okay. We don't just walk up to the White House, knock on the door and say, "Hey Trump, what's up?" We don't just book a flight to London, walk up to Buckingham Palace and have tea with Queen Elizabeth. You just don't do that. You cannot do that. But we as Christians in the Christian dispensation, past the law of Moses, we can walk in through those doors off that street and walk into the presence of the Creator of the universe. Boom. Just that fast. And worship Him. That is only possible through the atoning sacrifice, or the sacrifice of Jesus Christ on the cross. He did it once for all. The Levites or the Israelites had to do it every year. And more often than that, the yearly one was for the entire nation of Israel. The important thing that we need to keep in mind here is that these instruments, and there's other references in the Bible, every single time. I use this one because it's so plain. Every single time that instruments of music were used in worship in the Old Testament, they were in connection with the atoning sacrifice. Before the worshipers, the Israelites, could go in and give their thank offerings. They could not approach God any more than we can approach Queen Elizabeth. They had to be prepared. They had to be sanctified. They had to be consecrated. They couldn't just walk in through the doors and worship God because they didn't have the sacrifice of Jesus. They didn't have that. So they had to be prepared. And the important thing about this is in the Old Testament, each and every time that instruments were mentioned, it was in that part of their worship, before they were consecrated or forgiven or brought back into fellowship, however you want to look at it, so that they could approach God. Okay. In the book of Galatians, they had what they called Judaizers. That was people who came into the churches of Galatia, and they tried to bring them back under certain parts of the law of Moses. To be sure, to be more specific, the Israelites weren't real comfortable with this fact that you could be a child of God without circumcision. That was a big hang-up for them. That for centuries, that was the mark. If you were going to be a child of God, you had to be circumcised. If you weren't circumcised, you could not be a child of God. I realize we've kind of changed directions, but we've got to get all this put together. So, that was one of the things that the Galatians were faced, is with the Judaizers who just couldn't accept the fact that you could be a child of God in the body of Christ without circumcision. It's been opened up to all the Gentiles. Big problem in the first century. Big problem. Not just with the Galatian churches, all over. Paul wrote about it constantly. Because the people that didn't believe in Jesus Christ were trying to resist this movement. They wanted to do the law of Moses. They didn't want to give up some of the traditions and some of the things that were under the law of Moses because they just couldn't wrap their heads around it, or wouldn't. So, that being said, Paul wrote an entire letter devoted to just that very thing to the Galatians. And we're going to concentrate on one particular part of that lesson. It all it all built up to one thing. The entire letter is about Judaizing and the superiority of the covenant of Christ over the New Testament. The whole letter is about that. How much better it is. How much more effective it is. And then at the close of the letter, Paul slams the door on this little deal. He spent the whole letter explaining how much better. And now, at the end of the book of Galatians, Paul's going to drop the hammer, so to speak. Okay, and that hammer is what we're going to look at. Let's turn to Galatians 5, towards the end of the book. Galatians 5, verse 1. Has everybody made it? Galatians 5, 1 through 5. Paul writes, starting in verse 1, "Stand fast, therefore, in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage." He's talking about the law of Moses. Whenever he says that, that yoke of bondage, that is the law of Moses that he's referring to. "Behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that if ye be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing." Verse 3, "For I testify again to every man that is circumcised, that he is a debtor to do the whole law." In other words, if you become circumcised, if a Galatian or anybody became circumcised for the purpose of identifying themselves as a child of God, they have put themselves under the jurisdiction of the entire law of Moses. You can't just take one or the other. Can't pick and choose. Verse 4, "Christ is become of no effect unto you." None. "Whosoever of you are justified by the law," he's talking about the law of Moses here. "Whosoever of you are justified by the law, ye are fallen from grace." Okay. The Galatian Christians couldn't have it both ways. It was either the law of Moses or the law of Christ, or the gospel, however you want to mention it. One or the other. But here's the problem. And we didn't go through the whole book of Galatians, but the reason he put this at the end is because by the time they reached the end of this lesson, the readers in Galatia realized that the law of Moses could not save them. It only temporarily. It didn't have Jesus Christ. It didn't have the once for all sacrifice for sin for man forever. It lacked that. That being the case, the only thing the law of Moses could do was condemn. It could tell you that you've sinned. It could tell you that you're going to be condemned to hell for eternity. It could do that, but it couldn't save you. Okay? So, anybody at this point The readers in the Galatian churches already knew that. So this is what their choice was. You either go back to a law that cannot save you, that you're going to be lost anyway, or you're going to go with Christ. One or the other. You can go back. You're a debtor to a law that cannot save you. You will be lost. That was their choice. Okay. It was not just circumcision. Paul used this as an all-encompassing thing. This deal that he says about circumcision, anything pertaining to the law of Moses would be included in this. The sacrifices, all of that. Okay. And we established earlier that the instrumental music was a part of the atoning sacrifice of Old Testament worship. Through Christ, that's been accomplished. We don't have an atoning sacrifice. We had one. So much better off than the children of Israel under the law of Moses. We walked through those doors in fellowship with God. We don't have to do what they did. Now, if we set an organ up in here, or any kind of a man-made musical instrument, we are bringing back something that was attached to the atoning sacrifice of Jesus, of the animals. We are in effect rejecting the sacrifice of Jesus and going back to something that was not permanent. We're making a choice. When we set up an organ or something like that, we're making a choice. We're either going back to a law, we are putting ourselves in debt to a law that can't save us. Notice it said that the Levites did the singing. Notice it said that the Levites were playing the instrument. Okay, if we're going to set a musical instrument up in here and use it, this is what we've got to do. We've got to find the Levites. And the only singers that can sing have to be Levites. We're going to have to bring lambs, bullocks, and things in here, and we're going to have to build an altar. And we're going to have to slaughter those, and we're going to have to burn the meat, we're going to have to catch the blood, we're going to have to sprinkle it on that altar. I mean, it just goes on and on and on. We're going to have to do all that. And in the end, when we get that accomplished, we're not any better off than we were, because it's all for nothing, because it won't save us. The reason that the Israelites completely rejected man-made musical instruments in the first century was because to do so was to bring them back under the bondage of the old law, which could not save them. They were rejecting the sacrifice of Christ and falling from grace. That is why they were not used in the first century. Because to do so was to Judaize, and you're in the same boat as the Galatians were. That is the reason. And it is so important. And our young people nowadays, they're all about this modern stuff. You're playing with fire right here. This is a big deal. The people in the denominational world, they don't understand this. They don't, they don't get this. But that doesn't mean that it's not a consequence. That doesn't mean that it's not a fact that of the context in which these musical instruments were used in the Old Testament. How many of you here have said, well, they used them in the Old Testament, they ought to be okay in the New Testament? I've heard that a bunch of times. That's the reason you can't. And they don't know this. Jesus Christ died on the cross for us. And He offered the atoning sacrifice, the sacrifice that reinstates us in God's fellowship once for all man, for all time. It does not have to be repeated. Phase 2 of the Levitical worship, the Old Testament worship, was the thank offerings. Our worship in song, when we sing, is part of our thank offering. We sing praises to God, do we not? That's our thank offering. That's what Hezekiah told the people to do after they were consecrated. After the burnt offering was come in. They all went into the temple. There was no musical instruments in there. Those were thank offerings. Today, we have thank offerings. We don't have the other. Jesus took care of that for us. Thank God. Literally. He took care of that. We don't have to do all of that. Gone is all of that. Gone is all of the sacrifices, all of the bloodletting, all of the stuff associated with the once a year atoning sacrifice for the nation. It's gone. All we have left today is the thank offerings. We come in here, we worship God for His glory and for what He did for us. We learn and we offer our song as a thank offering. And if we play a musical instrument with that, a man-made musical instrument, we are mixing the Old Testament atoning sacrifice with the New Testament thank offerings. We cannot do that. If anybody thinks that God isn't serious about how this worship and this stuff is organized, take a look at Nadab and Abihu. They died because they used the wrong kind of fire in the brazier. We have Uzzah. He died because he touched the Ark of the Covenant. He's serious about this stuff. And if we cross those lines, then we have put ourselves in unnecessary danger. We have put ourselves in a position where we have fallen from grace. It is a big, big, big deal. And my goal for this was for everybody to understand why they did that in the first century. What Bobby said, dead on. He told us to sing. He told us to sing for a reason. And we've been looking at the reason today. He wants us to sing. Well, that's what we need to do. We need to be thankful. It's our thank offerings. It's a proper way that we are to worship God.